in order to make it available to you at a future time. So at the end, will be sending you out the email link or the links via email so you can access the recording once the presentation has been completed. So welcome everybody. My name is Ellen Lyons. I work for the Corps of Engineers in the Regulatory Division in Fairbanks, Alaska. It's great to see the wide variety of folks we have joining us today and the interest in the stream quantification tool. I'm going to right away hand it over to Matt LaCroix of the EPA to talk a little bit about the agenda today and the background of the development of the tool.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Matt LaCroix with EPA, based out of Anchorage, and again, we're glad that you're joining us. We're happy to see the interest in the tool. Hopefully, the information we provide you today will make you even more excited than you already are about the tool. So everyone is currently muted. We're going to maintain that for most of the day. We do have a question and answer session at the end of the day where we'll unmute the lines and we can have more of a conversation. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat. Hopefully everyone has access to that feature. If you don't, for some reason, because you don't have the app or something on your computer, you don't have that functionality, you should be able to raise your hand if you have a question during one of the presentations, but we'll be relying on the chat to the extent we can. We'll try and respond to questions in real time or at the end of a presentation. It depends perhaps on the complexity of the question, right? As Ellen said, we're recording, so folks will be able to view the presentations later and you'll be able to share them with your colleagues and hopefully extend that information out. Just a quick comment about the agenda. There's no changes to the agenda, but our only scheduled break is the lunch break. Yesterday, we stayed right to the agenda, so I don't anticipate we'll have any issues today. But so if folks are dropping off and coming back on because you've got some other conflict, we should be sticking right with this agenda. But if you do need to step away, then just go ahead, come back on. It shouldn't be a problem. I just have a few slides, talk a little bit about the how and the why of the stream quantification tool. And to a certain extent, this was really about giving credit where credit is due. And in BLM's, I don't think we have anyone from BLM on the call today, so I'll just say it's all on them, you know, for better or for worse. They really have been key to helping create this tool and advocating for it. So way to go, Matt Varner. For years now, both state and federal agencies have been collaborating on the review of proposed development projects, but also on design and implementation of restoration projects. And so there's been collaborative efforts to bring training on the stream functions pyramid, design, stream restoration design courses to Alaska. And, you know, throughout that collaboration, there's been this undercurrent that wouldn't it be great if we actually had a tool where we could quantify changes in function and we could use that both in regulatory and non-regulatory programs. And so there was a commitment to help, you know, trying to figure out if we can make that happen a couple of years ago. The agencies you see listed as being members of a steering committee were convened, and there was a kickoff in February of 2020 where agencies said, yeah, we're willing to work to make this happen. We're willing to put in time and resources. And lo and behold, about a year and a half later, we have a tool. So that's a great thing, and hopefully you'll agree that it's a great thing. It wouldn't have happened. I mean, the agency said, yeah, we see a need. We'd like to have a tool, but really wouldn't have happened without some very important players. The Salcha Delta Soil and Water Conservation District was the project manager and really steered this through the process from the kickoff to a functioning tool. And it also wouldn't have happened without the expertise of our contractors. So Stream Mechanics, and will be presenting from Stream Mechanics, and then Ecosystem Planning and Restoration. Sydney will be presenting from EPR. And these folks have developed stream quantification tools in other parts of the country, and so they were able to bring a suite of knowledge and information and technique to Alaska to make it possible for us to have a tool. But we wanted input from folks that know the state, know the streams, know the programs, and so there were technical committees that were convened for about the first year, so 2020, and there was important input provided by staff from Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Department of Natural Resources, staff from the University of Alaska and Fairbanks, and then input and support from the organization Resolve, and they have a project called Salmon Gold, and they were involved with the development of the SQT as well. Just briefly, and you'll hear more about this from Will and Sydney, but as I mentioned, there are stream quantification tools that have been developed in other parts of the country for streams that occur there. And so we knew this was a technique and it was an approach, a framework that worked and has been used in other parts of the country, but we really needed it to be about Alaska streams, what our streams look like, how they function. And so that's where the regionalization process comes in. And as you can see on the slide, this tool that we have that's specific to the interior of Alaska is based on information, reference data from our streams. The parameters were selected because they're applicable to our streams. The measurement techniques were selected because they're applicable to our streams. The stratification that exists in the tool is specific to our streams, and the calibration of the parameter scores is. So again, you'll hear more about that, but just know this is not something that, we're not using a tool that is specific to some other part of the country. And just to emphasize that point a little bit more, most of the reference data, well, all the reference data is Alaska reference data. The majority of it is BLM data, came from their AIM program. And you can just see on this graphic where we have data around the state and within the interior is what's applicable to this tool. So from a variety of different ecosystems within the interior of Alaska. And the why is, well, why are agencies interested in having this tool? So really it's to have a yardstick, it's to have a metric that we can speak in a quantitative way. It's to be able to compare apples to apples. So, we've got red fruits in the bowl here. They're not all the same. And rather than being content to say, well, we're doing a stream restoration project, so it must be improving stream function, or we're doing a development project, or we're stabilizing a bank, or we're doing something. So there's probably some impact, but we don't know what it is, right? You say, wouldn't it be great if we had a yardstick and a way to measure those changes in condition and be able to speak kind of in a more quantitative way, right? And that's hopefully what the SQT is going to allow us to do. So for, in the past, we haven't had a tool. Now we have a tool. We haven't started really using it yet. We're hoping that as practitioners, you on the line today will be helping us to do that. But you're probably familiar with everything that's incumbent on not having a tool. It's hard to communicate. It's hard to coordinate. It's hard to collect, use, and share consistent data. It's hard to be consistent in how you're dealing with one project compared to another project. It's hard to do monitoring, right? So the bottom line is that it's hard to really conserve our streams if we don't have a tool such as this. That's my promotional speech. But where do we go from here? It's all about using the tool, testing it out, improving it if it needs to be improved, or where it needs to be improved, because let's just assume it will need to be improved, getting the feedback from practitioners. And then if there's a consensus that, yeah, this really makes sense and it's valuable, it's worth the effort to generate the tool, then perhaps we look to other parts of the state where we also continue to not have a tool and to develop it. So there's been a little bit of exploratory data collection on the North Slope to just evaluate whether it would be possible to develop an SQT for beaded streams as well as alluvial streams on the North Slope. And so it's possible that if there's, like we said, a consensus that this tool is worthwhile, that we would regionalize one for the North Slope next. But certainly, we're just interested in people testing it out and providing their feedback. Okay. So that's what I've got to say. I'll turn it back over to Ellen. Thanks so much. We're glad you're here.
Thanks, Matt. So I just wanted to share with you the Ribbits website. I'll give it a minute to load up, but the Ribbits website is where we are storing all of the documents associated with the stream quantification tool. So if you go to Ribbits and you go to Alaska and to the assessment tools, you'll see stream assessment tools, and you'll see we have the user manual, the mitigation procedures, which is a core document, the Alaska quantification tool debit calculator, the user tool or the stream quantification tool itself, and then associated background information and forms. And so everything we're going to talk about today is available for you to download off this Ribbits website. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the procedures document. One question I'm guessing a lot of people have is, will the Corps require the use of the stream quantification tool? And the Corps does not require the use of any specific functional assessment tool. And so we won't necessarily require the use of the stream quantification tool. But since the Corps helped develop this tool, we believe it's going to be a very effective tool. We're definitely going to encourage its use. And there are going to be times when it's going to be very, very appropriate for the stream quantification tool to be used and submitted as part of your application package. So I really encourage you all to go in and look at the Alaska Stream Mitigation Procedures document. It kind of outlines the Corps' thought process with regards to the use of the tool, what needs to be submitted to us when you use it, how we're going to review it, it goes through the regulations that guide its use. And one thing I just want to point out, and I'm sure someone else will do it as well, but this is not a statewide tool. This is a tool for the interior of Alaska, as Matt showed, and it's for the alluvial and wadable alluvial and colluvial valleys in the interior of Alaska. So there is a specific area and specific stream types where this tool is going to be most effective. And the other thing I just want to emphasize is that the Corps did help develop this tool. We believe this tool is going to improve predictability and consistency, both in the information that is collected to support the assessment of both the impacts and any uplift that could occur in proposed projects. But I think over time, it will also really help the Corps become more consistent and predictable in our mitigation decisions. So the more that this tool is used, the better the user gets and the better the Corps gets at incorporating it into our decision-making process. So at the end of the presentation on the tool itself, we can also answer any additional questions you may have about Corps process or Corps thoughts with regards to this tool. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Will Harmon to talk about the stream function pyramid framework. And I'll stop sharing. Oh, you got it. Okay.
Got it. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Ellen.
Yeah.
Before I dive into the presentation, let me give you a little bit of an overview of the rest of the day. So I'm actually not going to talk about the stream quantification tool, at least not much in this morning session. And instead, I'm going to focus on the stream functions pyramid framework, which is the background, literally the framework behind the SQT. The SQT is an application of the framework. So this first presentation is big picture, a little bit of overview of stream functions, overview of the stream functions pyramid, the framework, and then I'll transition to a second presentation where I'll share some of the key parameters and metrics that are included in the SQT. I'm just not going to get into the weeds about what the SQT is and how it works. So that's the morning. We'll have a break for lunch, and then after lunch, Sydney will take over and give a presentation on the SQT and the debit calculator. So she'll get a little bit more specific and kind of get more detailed about the SQT itself as a tool. And then after she's done, I'll come back and we'll play a little bit. So I'll crack open the SQT spreadsheet. We have a real world project in Alaska. We'll enter some existing condition data into that, some proposed condition data, and just play a little bit. And then we will leave time at the end for some open discussion and questions. So that's our roadmap going forward. So with that, I'll get started. And as I mentioned, this first presentation is on the overview of the Stream Functions Pyramid Framework. There is a document that goes with this. So, I'm going to give a 30, 45-minute presentation on this. This is a 340-page book. So I'm obviously not going to cover everything. If you would like to learn more about the framework, again, not the SQT, you can download this document from the Stream Mechanics webpage, and it'll give you more information and more detail. All right, so the first thing I want to do is just acknowledge, we're going to start really big picture and just acknowledge that streams come in all different shapes and sizes. They have different personalities. But they all have similar or some similar functions. So if we were all together in a room, I would have you start calling out, like, what are some functions that are similar between these pictures? And somebody would raise their hand and say, transport water. And we would say, yes, transporting water is a function of a stream. And then we would talk about transporting sediment as a function of a stream. Now, as we look at these pictures, the volume and the rate and the timing of both water and sediment transport varies quite a bit among these different systems, but they all are transporting water and sediment. And then when we look at some of the difference in these streams, we obviously see that gradient is a big difference. Some of these streams are low gradient, some of them are high gradient. We have single thread channels and multi-thread channels. So they do all come in these different sizes and shapes and personalities. So as stream restoration practitioners, or just those who do assessments, one of our challenges is dealing with all of those differences. If we have an assessment method, one method, how can we deal in that one method with the fact that streams can be so different over one geography? We're focused on the interior of Alaska, and we have a lot of variability in streams there. So that's one thing that we'll work on as we go through the day. Like, how do we do that? The other thing is us ourselves. Again, if we were in a room together where I could see you and you could see me and we could talk, and I would do a poll, and I would see how many of you are engineers, how many of you are geomorphologists, how many of you are hydrologists, how many of you are biologists, and so on. And that's important because each of us approaches this work through a lens. And that lens is our academic background and our practical experience. When we look at a stream, we see it through those eyes. My background is geomorphology. So when I look at a stream, I'm looking at it as a geomorphologist, both from my schoolwork, my academic training, and then my decades of experience in doing the work. So I kind of have that shown on this slide. If we look over here at the engineers and we ask an engineer, hey, what's the function of a stream? That engineer, the first thing they're going to say is to transport water. And again, that is a function of a stream. It's one function of a stream. It is not the only function of a stream. And then we come over here to the geologist or the geomorphologist and we say, what's a function of a stream? They're going to talk about sediment transport, maybe large wood storage and transport, but their focus is going to be on these physical functions. Why does the stream look the way it does, that form, given the processes that are occurring in the watershed? And then if we come over here to the ecologist and we ask the ecologist, hey, what's a function of a stream? We're going to have to pull up a chair and get comfortable because they are going to talk for quite a while. And they're going to talk about stream habitat, the life histories of aquatic organisms, maybe stream metabolism, nutrient cycling, and so on. And of course, they are correct as well. And in fact, for those of you that are ecologists, if we really wanted to, we could probably lump all of this under the discipline of ecology. It is a very broad study of organisms and their interrelationships with their habitat. But that's, certainly historically, we've had challenges as these different disciplines communicating with each other and kind of agreeing when we have a project on what should be done and what should not be done. And so again, that's part of our goal here with this framework, is to improve that communication. All right, so to make matters worse, we have this definition, or this concept really, of restoration. So what is restoration? And I kind of like this definition from one of AGU's books, American Geophysical Union. And they say stream restoration is a catch-all term. I agree. It is a catch-all term used to describe a wide range of management actions, and as such is difficult to define. It really is true. You can talk to some people who are purist, and a restoration means, it must be returned to this pre-disturbed condition. Others take a looser approach. And so this definition of stream restoration can vary with the perspective or discipline of the practitioner, or with the temporal and spatial scale under consideration. So it's kind of a crummy term, but it is one that is ubiquitous throughout, the stream assessment and restoration industry. Although many of you in Alaska, if you're working more on the mining side, reclamation is the regulatory term that's used more than restoration. But for those of us that would be doing compensatory mitigation, that is under restoration. And I will say I like the definition of restoration better as part of the mitigation rule. So that definition says restoration means the manipulation of the physical, chemical, or biological characteristics of a site with the goal of returning natural/historic functions to a former or degraded aquatic resource. And then reestablishment and rehabilitation are lumped underneath that restoration definition. So there are a few things I like about this definition as a practitioner. One is that word manipulation. So restoration is implying that we are going to go to the field and do something. There will be an activity involved or employed to have some return. And that return is that we will manipulate the physical, chemical, or biological characteristics, and we want to return those natural or historic functions. And typically for streams, it's not a former resource, it's a degraded resource. This is a definition applied to both streams and wetlands. All right, so I'm getting ready to show you the stream functions pyramid framework. So just keep in mind that it is a concept. It is a way of thinking about how stream functions support each other to create a healthy stream corridor. So you'll hear as we go through the day that it is not just about the stream channel. It is also about that adjacent land area, be it a floodplain, be it a bankful bench, low terrace. It is also for the restoration practitioner. Like, this thought process, this concept was built on the idea that people will be using it to try to have better stream restoration projects. It is not meant to be a tool or a framework to show all of the different interrelationships among functions. And so the primary thought process is this: if you want to achieve a certain level of restoration, know what supporting functions you need. And I'll flesh that idea out a little bit as we move through here. All right, so here's the stream functions pyramid. This is what we call the broad level view. And you can see at the very base of this framework, we have geology and climate. So they're not part of the pyramid itself. They kind of sit underneath the pyramid and just acknowledge that geology and climate are driving all of these higher functions. It is why streams in Alaska look different than streams in Arizona and streams in North Carolina. Different geology, different climate. So we're going to focus on these 5 what we call functional categories. So that's an important term to remember. Functional category is used, it is brought forward and used in the SQT. And so there are 5 functional categories. The first is hydrology. And then with each functional category, there's a functional statement. And so the functional statement for hydrology is the transport of water from the watershed to the channel. Next is hydraulics. So basically this thought process is saying first we have to get water from the watershed to the channel. Then we recognize the hydraulic functions, which is the transport of water in the channel, on the floodplain, and through sediments. Once that water is in the channel or moving in the channel and on the floodplain, it can do work. And that work is expressed in the geomorphology category. So it is the transport of that water now is transporting wood and sediment to create diverse bed forms and dynamic equilibrium. And I'll get into this more later, but you can kind of think of the diverse bed forms as habitat and the dynamic equilibrium as channel stability. And then number 4 here is physicochemical. Notice there is a C in physicochemical. It's the physical and chemical processes. The functional statement is the temperature and oxygen regulation, the processing of organic matter and nutrients. And then finally on top are the biology functions. So this is the biodiversity and the life histories of aquatic and riparian life. And if I had to do this over again, I would add a word right here, and that word would be animal. That really was the thinking and the thought process, is that this biology would be the biodiversities and the life histories of aquatic and riparian animal life. So think macroinvertebrates, think fish in particular as being that community. The other thing to remember is that, especially for those of you on this meeting that are biologists, in this framework, biology is not synonymous with habitat. And if you look at this functional statement, you'll understand why. It's the biodiversity and the life histories of critters, not the home that those critters live in. That would be down here, primarily in geomorphology, but you could certainly make an argument that habitat resides in all 4 of these. Water is a form of habitat, right? So hydrology. All right, so there are 2 types of people in the world. There are lumpers and there are splitters. I am generally a lumper by nature, but this is a splitting activity. So if we look at this definition of function from the Clean Water Act, it is the physical, chemical, and biological processes that occur in ecosystems. And so now if we want to overlay that with our pyramid, then it would be these lower level functions like the hydrology, hydraulic, and geomorphology are more of your physical. Transitioning into physicochemical, that would be more of your chemical, and then the biological at the top. I tend to think of this slide as one of the primary ways to think about the pyramid, especially again from a stream restoration perspective, that these lower level functions are more of your cause and these higher functions are more of your effect. And so think about that from a practitioner perspective. If you have a stream restoration project and your goal is to return Arctic grayling, well, that's up here in biology, but you can't just take a bucket of Arctic grayling and dump it in a degraded stream reach and say, you are restored, have a nice life, right? Because there are stressors and limitations, limiting factors that will prevent that from happening if it's a degraded stream. If it's a stream with no pool habitat, that Arctic grayling is going to leave and go somewhere else. And so we think of it that way, that in particular, physicochemical and biology are more of the effects of restoration efforts, and those efforts primarily are in hydraulics and geomorphology. I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a second. And then hydrology down here at the bottom. Another way to think of this is just to say, if we want a certain function up here in biology, we want to return the Arctic grayling to this project reach, what supporting functions do we need in order to make that happen? And so we drill down, we go into physicochemical and say, do we have the temperature regime that is needed for Arctic grayling? We come down here in geomorphology and say, do we have the right bed form diversity and the correct channel stability to support that Arctic grayling? In hydraulics, do we have too much velocity, for example? Is it an size channel? And then for hydrology, maybe just base flow. Is it an area where base flow has been impacted and now we don't have enough base flow to support those fish? And so that really is the way to think about this. Again, if we were in a room together, someone would probably raise their hand about now and say, well, what about beavers, right? What about beavers? Because beavers would be biology. They would sit right here, and beavers certainly can affect all the way down into hydrology. So it seems to flip this thing upside down. But that's not the right way to use this framework. Again, we're not looking at all the interrelationships among functions. The way that you would use beaver in this framework is to say, instead of what are all the functions that beaver is affecting, we would say, if we want to have a healthy beaver population, what are the supporting functions in physicochemical and on down do we need in order to achieve that goal? And then this logic holds. All right, so kind of moving on with this concept, the hydrology component, generally these parameters are independent variables, meaning we have to understand watershed hydrology, but we will probably not change hydrology. I say generally because if you are working in a small watershed and you are doing upland work, you are changing the runoff processes in that watershed, that would be the exception. Typically, we are, as practitioners, making direct changes to the hydraulic and geomorphology functions. Whether this is a process-based approach or a form-based approach does not matter. These are the categories that we are manipulating the most in order to get our restoration response. And then for physicochemical and biology, it's not just what we do at the reach, it's how is that, what's going on upstream of the reach? Like what's the watershed context or quality related to the reach that we're working in? And so we may fix all the reach problems and achieve some of that stability and habitat, but if the upstream watershed is trashed, we probably will not move the needle much for physicochemical and biology. All right, so kind of moving on, why do we need this concept? Well, for those of us working in stream restoration, and as Matt said, we want to quantify the functional lift. Hopefully we all agree that the picture on the right looks better than the picture on the left, but how much better? And so that's what we're really after, both with the stream functions pyramid framework and with the SQT. And then from a mitigation perspective, it's important as well because the mitigation rule tells us that the number of credits should reflect the difference. And so it is a delta, a difference between pre and post compensatory mitigation project site conditions as determined by a functional or condition assessment or other suitable metrics. So that really is this framework and this tool is bigger than compensatory mitigation, but it is probably definitely used the most in this regulatory world for this reason right here. And then we call this functional lift. So you'll hear that term kind of used throughout. So in a regulatory context, there's a flip side as well. And Matt was alluding to this in his presentation. Hopefully we all agree that this picture looks worse than this picture, but again, how much worse? We want to be able to quantify that. And then we want to make sure there is parity between the credits and the debits. So credits should follow debits in terms of the methodology used. So this credit method should be the same as the debit method. And you'll hear that when Sydney presents after lunch. She will first give you an overview of the stream quantification tool, and then she will talk about how the SQT is modified to be a debit calculator as well. All right, so everything that I just did was this broad level view. It's called the stream functions pyramid. We talked about these functional categories and functional statements. And so the rest of the framework really is just fleshing out this concept. And we're going to add function-based parameters that describe and support that functional statement. Then we're going to add measurement methods / metrics. Now, I have to apologize because I know I'm hitting you with a lot of terms. And just to add insult to injury, we have been changing some of our terms as we move through time. So if you download that book I was showing in the beginning, you will see the term measurement methods used here. But as you read SQT user manuals, you'll see the word metric. They are synonymous terms. I think people just got tired of writing 2 words, and so they made 1 word. So metrics is now more commonly used than measurement method, but they are the same thing. And their purpose in life is to quantify that parameter. And then attached to each metric, and again, here's a change. In that book, we called these performance standards, and now in the SQT manuals, we call them reference standards. And within these reference standards, we have 3 functional capacity ratings, 1 for functioning, 1 for functioning at risk, and 1 for not functioning. So the rest of this presentation, or the next section, is I'm just going to give you a little bit more of a flavor of what this means. So first, parameters. And again, I'm not going to define all of these right now. I'll get into more of that with the next presentation. The coding here, the color coding, is that these parameters that are in black font are parameters that are in that original book. Parameters that are in red font are parameters that have been added as part of SQT regionalization efforts. So again, as Matt mentioned, SQTs are tailored to the state that they're in. And as that happens, our list of parameters as choices increases. And then the 2 parameter, or the parameters that are highlighted in yellow, are the parameters that were selected for use in the Alaska SQT. So there's a catchment hydrology parameter and a reach runoff parameter. For hydraulics, for Alaska, there's floodplain connectivity and flow dynamics. Again, I'm just showing you the list now compared to the overall list, and then I will define these in the next presentation. Geomorphology has the most parameters, and it has the most in the Alaska SQT. So we have large woody debris storage and transport, lateral migration, riparian vegetation, bed form diversity, and bed material characterization. This is where the fun happens. And then we also have parameters in physicochemical, so temperature, turbidity, and then Alaska added diatoms. So this is the only SQT in the country that has diatoms as a parameter for now. And then in biology, we have macroinvertebrate communities and fish communities, which are pretty standard for all SQTs. There has been some discussion in states that have large ephemeral channels to add amphibians, which would be awesome. It has not happened yet. There have been some places where mussel restoration is really important, and so there's been discussion of that, but these are things that have not happened yet. So macroinvertebrate communities, fish communities are the most common. All right, so remember that attached to those parameters are these measurement methods or metrics. Again, I'm not going to do definitions at this point. I just want you to be visualizing the framework. And so the point here is that here is a function-based parameter. This one's called floodplain connectivity. And then attached to floodplain connectivity, in this example, are 2 measurement methods or metrics. You must have at least 1 metric attached to a parameter, and you can have more than 1. Some parameters like riparian vegetation, bed form diversity have more than 2, 3, sometimes 4 metrics. All right, and so these reference standards, as I mentioned, were divided into these categories of functioning, functioning at risk, and not functioning. They're linked to the metrics, and they are based on reference condition. And so here's what we mean by reference condition or a reference standard in that functioning category. It would be that subset of reference aquatic resources that are least disturbed and exhibit the highest level of functions. So we consider that functioning for the metric that's being assessed. And again, it ranges from least disturbed to pristine condition. Sydney will get into this in a little bit more detail when she goes over the SQT and shows you the actual scoring. But just as a preview, the scoring ranges from 0 to 1 for every metric, and 1.0 is always pristine. And so we can have some discussion if you want on what that means and how do you even come up with that. That might be fun. All right, so I also just want to point out, I kind of already mentioned this, that there is a difference in this framework and the SQT. Like if you go into that document, you're not going to see any mention of the stream quantification tool. It did not exist when we wrote the framework. And the framework really stops at the metric level. In that original book, we still have functioning at risk, and not functioning. And we did give some example performance standards for those metrics, but they were a little bit they were more categorical. We put values into those 3 buckets, and we stopped at the metric level. So you as a practitioner, if you had 3 metrics for a given parameter, you would have to use your professional judgment to roll those metric scores up into a unified parameter score. And then if you wanted to roll that up to the functional category score, like hydraulics, you would have to use your judgment to do that as well. And I personally like that as a practitioner. It allowed me to kind of have my rationale and explain that rationale. I felt more like a stream doctor. You know, you're doing all these tests and saying, okay, now what is the overall health of the stream? The problem with that method in a regulatory world is that it opens itself up to a lot of gamesmanship. And so the stream quantification tool removes that judgment from the scoring. And as I mentioned, it uses this index from a 0 to 1 at the metric level to roll up and create parameter, functional category, and overall reach scores. All right, so kind of closing out this presentation, there are several different applications from the framework. So this is actually chapter 10 in that book, if you're looking at it. And we list function-based assessments as an application. And we give some guidance on how people could go about creating those assessments. And again, the SQT then is an actual application that came out of that framework. One of my favorite applications of the framework is the development of function-based goals and objectives and this notion of restoration potential. This also was brought forward into the SQT, and even though it's one of my favorite components of the framework, we are not going to spend much time on that today. Our primary goal today is to kind of give you a big picture view of the framework, the parameters, and then kind of how the SQT works from a scoring perspective. We also list debit and credit determination methods as an application. And so they are complementary, but not the same. Like the SQT is a standalone tool that could be used within mitigation. And if you're working with grant organizations or just other people that it's not for mitigation, you can still use the SQT, but there is I'll use the word policy, I'll put that in quotes, component that does lay out how the tool can be used to help inform or develop debits and credits. And then there are more applications. We've seen people use this in the NEPA process, and there seems to be kind of a continuous evolution of the different applications of the framework. All right, so I do want to kind of end with this notion of restoration potential, just because I feel like it's very important. I don't want people to forget about it. It's not going to be the focus of today, but it is part of the SQT. Our definition of restoration potential is that it's the highest level of restoration, and level here refers to the pyramid. So level 3, level 4, level 5, that can be achieved based on watershed conditions, result of your reach scale, function-based assessment, and then any project constraints that you have. And so basically what this is doing is saying, okay, you've got a reach that you're going to work on. Is this what's upstream of your reach? If so, you are a happy camper, and you can fix the perturbations in your reach and most likely restore biology to a reference condition because it's at a reference condition upstream of your reach. But if you're this poor sap and you're working downstream from, this is Charlotte, North Carolina, that's not going to happen. Like you can make some great changes at the reach scale. You can achieve stability. You can improve habitat. You might even increase life a little bit. There might be some macroinvertebrates and fish that come into your reach, but it will not look like a reference condition. And so this thought process helps the practitioner articulate that restoration potential and really just put it into these kind of categories of full restoration potential or partial restoration potential. So full restoration potential really means you can take this reach back. It's like the true definition of restoration, that you can restore your reach back to an undisturbed condition. The biology is that reference condition. Partial restoration means, hey, you can do good work. You can improve stability. You can improve habitat. You might even move the needle in a good way for physicochemical and biology, but it's not going to look like a reference condition. You know, Alaska may have more opportunity to do full restoration than any other place in the country. But speaking of restoration in total, nationally speaking, more projects would be in this partial restoration category than the full restoration category. And I'm not here to say that's a bad thing. I think it can be a good thing. It is what it is. I guess one thing I am here to do is to try to encourage all of us to be very clean and clear with our communication so that people know what the expectations are and what goals and objectives are achievable from our project. So I think that is it. Yep, that's it for this presentation. So I'm going to take a sip of water, see if you have questions, start loading up the other presentation, and if you have questions, great. If not, we'll keep rolling.
No questions in the chat so far.
Okay.
In the absence of questions, whose dog is in the picture in your background?
Oh, that's Shannon Kuykendall's dog from the National Park Service in Alaska.
Looks like a legitimate wolf.
Yeah. Yeah, she was awesome. All right, we all good? Everybody ready to roll? All right. So this next presentation is just an overview of what I'm calling key parameters and metrics. And this information is in the SQT. So you can see this in some of the spreadsheets. And it's called a metric selection guide. So I am pulling out a subset of the parameters and metrics to go over in this presentation. They are what we call required parameters and metrics. I am using this term a little bit loosely because there are some parameters that I want to go over, even though they're not always required. So I'll try to remember to give you those caveats as we move through here. A couple things to note from this slide is that we're really only focusing on the first three categories: hydrology, hydraulics, geomorphology. So as practitioners know that if you were required to use this tool, you are only required, I'll put that in quotes, to measure these parameters through geomorphology. Physicochemical parameters and biology parameters are always optional because their use or their measurement is really dependent on the outcome of that restoration potential analysis. If you do not think you have a project reach that can move the needle on physicochemical and biology, then you do not have to measure it, at least on the restoration side. So these parameters are really where most of your work will take place. So for hydrology, there's one parameter that's pretty much always required, and that's called reach runoff. And then there are a variety of metrics associated with that parameter. I'll go over that in just a minute. Under hydraulics, there are two parameters. So we have floodplain connectivity. There are two metrics associated with floodplain connectivity. And then flow dynamics. There is one metric associated with flow dynamics. In geomorphology, I guess really there are only these first two that are always required, which would be lateral migration and riparian veg. And then there are two metrics for lateral migration that are always measured, and then armoring is assessed if it's present. And then under riparian veg, we have two metrics that are always assessed, and then native cover is optional. I'll get into the weeds a little bit more as we move along. Sorry, couldn't resist that pun. I would say no pun intended, but I did think about it before I said it, so I guess it was intended. Bed form diversity, I always think of bed form diversity as required, but Sydney will kind of point out, or I'll point out now, that if you were in a bedrock dominated system, bed form diversity is not measured. So it is almost always required, but I guess technically not always. And we have three metrics that go with bed form diversity. And then also large woody debris technically is not required. It is required if you're working in a watershed in a stream corridor that is naturally forested. So most of the time in the interior, you will assess wood. Like if you're working at a really high elevation, maybe not, but most of the time you would include wood. And so I did include it here. There is one more in geomorphology that'll probably used fairly often. I'm not going to go over it today. That is bed material characterization. You would use that if you had a site, maybe it was a mining site that had a gravel bed with a lot of fines in the bank, and you thought that your project could coarsen the bed, then you would probably do bed material. But it is optional in that regard, so I was not going to go over it. It is in the user manual though. All right, so this is to let you know the focus of this presentation and a bit of a reminder for me to not get too off target. So with this presentation, as I go through these parameters and metrics, I'm going to focus on the what and the why, and I am not going to get into the how. So I am not going to tell you in this presentation how you would go to the field and measure these metrics. That is in the user manual, and many of these metrics are from existing assessment methods. And so you would just go to that assessment method and follow their protocol. Hopefully, if you're doing that assessment method, you already know that assessment method. So we're going to kind of answer this question. What are the parameters and metrics, and why are they important to include in the SQT? All right, so we'll start down here at the bottom and we'll work our way towards the top, but we will stop here at geomorphology. All right. So our first parameter is reach runoff. Again, it's part of that hydrology category. And so since it is part of that category, all parameters are at least helping us with some aspect of that functional statement. So as a reminder, that is how water is moving from the watershed to the channel. Reach runoff, though, is specific to the project reach. And so we are assessing runoff potential from land uses that are adjacent to the project reach. And I'll show you a map next that hopefully makes that a little bit clearer. This one is, this particular parameter in the SQT gives you options on how you can make your measurements. And so I pulled this right out of the user manual. So you can see that you have a choice. I'm going to start over here on the right first. You can measure the land use coefficient and concentrated flow points, or you could assess percent impervious cover and anthropogenic land cover and concentrated flow points. So note that you will be assessing concentrated flow points regardless of which path you choose. This path is a little bit more if you're working in a developed watershed and you believe that you can make some of these changes, then you would pick this column. Otherwise, you'll pick this column. And this is the one that I'm going to focus on for this presentation. All right, so here's an example of what I mean by lateral drainage area. So here's our project reach. Here's the upstream end of the reach. Here's the downstream end of the reach. And so whenever we have a project, one of the first things we do is delineate the watershed to the downstream end. And so this would be our overall watershed. And you can see that that area is 12.1 square miles. Again, 12.1 square miles to the downstream end. This parameter called reach runoff is only looking at the potential for water to move from the watershed to the channel between the upstream and downstream limits. And so we call that the lateral drainage area. And we pull that out as an area. So in this example, it's 0.38 square miles of lateral drainage area. And then within that lateral drainage area, we are measuring lift and loss by determining the land use change. That really is the activity. So it's pretty simple. Like, what are the land use categories in the lateral drainage area, and how are you going to change those land uses as a result of your impact or as a result of your restoration activity? So it is really a desktop, primarily a desktop drill, although you could go out in the field with a GPS and measure these land use areas, but you do need to know that your land use type, and then what's the acreage of that land use type. And then we want to recognize that, hey, there are functional differences between these land uses. A natural vegetated cover, whether it's tundra or, you know, a forest, black spruce, so on, that has a very different runoff potential than a parking lot. And so we want to acknowledge that difference, and we do that with these coefficients. So in your user manual, you will have this table 6, land use coefficients. You'll see all the different land use descriptions and a coefficient assigned to those different land uses. So you do not have to go figure out these assignments on your own. You've just got to make these land use determinations, figure out the size, and then apply these coefficients to those land uses. So here's a picture example of what we're talking about. This is a placer mine reclamation site along the, off the Denali Highway. This is during reclamation. So you can see the stream kind of has been reworked here. Transplants have been placed along the bank. And then these tailing piles have been graded back to a more gentle slope. This really is what the reach runoff parameter will capture. As this goes from bare ground to a vegetated community again, you'll see that reach runoff parameter improve. And of course, ultimately, we would want this to look like this, but that's going to take a long time. So this is one of those parameters that you would not be able to go from. This would be basically zero function for reach runoff. This would be pristine function, but you're not going to go from no function to pristine function over the course of a monitoring period. And so you might go from no function to functioning at risk during your monitoring period, and that's the lift that we would look at capturing. But again, to kind of summarize, the reach runoff parameter is really looking at the hill slopes, if you will, between the stream reach and that watershed divide, and then that land use change in this example from just after mining to X number of years after reclamation. And I'm kind of mixing, I don't want to freak anybody out here. I'm showing a reclamation example and kind of talking about the SQT and how it could be used. Reclamation has its own set of performance standards. So I don't want to freak anybody out in that I'm kind of mixing. I'm just trying to show project examples, not tied to any regulatory program. All right, so the other metric is concentrated flow points. This one's super simple. You're just going to count the number of concentrated flow points. So these would be ephemeral channels that are caused by human impacts. That is a key thing to remember. If it is a natural ephemeral channel, you would not count it. It's got to be an ephemeral channel. So really, you'll notice over here on the examples, the common word is ditch. I mean, these are really ditches, and could be pipes, ditches or pipes that are bringing concentrated flow from that lateral drainage area right to the channel. And so all you have to do for this part of the assessment is count them and then report them as a number per 1,000 feet. Here's a classic concentrated flow point. So here's our parking lot, concrete swell, bringing that concentrated flow right to the channel. And so, of course, what we would want to do from a restoration perspective is get rid of this concentrated flow point. You can think about this, even if there was this really great buffer, like you came in here and planted all these trees, you could have all these great trees, but they're really not doing much because you're taking all the water and bypassing the buffer through this concrete pipe. So that's what we're trying to get away from. Here's more of an Alaskan example, not the greatest example in the world, but just wanted to give a non-urban example. So this is actually an active placer mine. So it's a little unfair to be showing concentrated flow points during an active mine, but you can see the road here. That would bring concentrated water from the little camp up here right down to the channel. Over here, you can see a little bit of water stored on this road, bringing that water to the channel here. So these would be two concentrated flow points that are there now, and then we would just have to see if that road and these concentrated flow points remain after mining is complete. If they are, then they would stay as concentrated flow points. All right, so as I mentioned, the idea here, at least on the restoration side, is to get rid of concentrated flow points. So here's an example from, this is Casper, Wyoming. I think this is the Platte River. This is a stream restoration project, and there's a road right up here. And so basically what they did is they took the outlet of this pipe and put a little forebay after that pipe and then a level spreader. And so they're taking water that's concentrated and spreading it out over this short riparian area. Here's another example where they cut the pipes, have a little bit of an energy dissipator, and then a large kind of basin, almost mimicking like an oxbow, so that water can just infiltrate into this basin rather than going straight into the channel. So in both of these cases, these would be examples of how they could eliminate a concentrated flow point and get functional lift by doing so. One thing you cannot do is take like 3 or 4 or 5 pipes and combine them into one pipe and get kind of credit for that as being a functional lift. So sometimes we have to create rules to the game to keep people from literally gaming the system. So you can't do that. It does not count. It's got to be a functional improvement. All right, so that was hydrology. So there's really only one parameter that is required in hydrology. It is reach runoff. Catchment hydrology is another parameter in hydrology. You'll see that in the SQT and the user manual, but it's optional. So since it's optional, I was not going to focus on it today. We only have so much time today to go over things. All right, so our next category is the hydraulic category. And we have 2 parameters for the hydraulic category. So floodplain connectivity and flow dynamics. So again, since these are 2 parameters in hydraulics, it's helping us understand at least part of the functional statement of how water moves in the channel on the floodplain and through sediments. And to be fair, really, we're capturing these first two. Floodplain connectivity is a little bit of both. It's telling you to some degree how water is behaving in the channel, more so on the floodplain. And then our flow dynamics is focused on water moving in the channel. We really do not have a parameter in any SQT that does like hyphoretic exchange. We talk about it in the framework book, and there certainly are researchers at universities who study that, but we have not found a just practical way to make that a component of SQTs and practitioners. It's a pretty involved method. So far, all of our SQT parameters and metrics have focused more on moving water in the channel and on the floodplain. All right, I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on floodplain connectivity. Like if you asked me, hey Will, of all these parameters, which one do you think is the most important? I would tell you floodplain connectivity. In fact, I think the primary mission of a stream restoration practitioner is to give floodplains back to streams or rivers. And there's a plethora of ways to do that. You can pick your favorite design approach, from natural channel design to stage 0, doesn't matter. In both of those cases, the primary objective is to reconnect streams to floodplains, and it drives many functions. I could spend the rest of the day talking about all the functions that are affected by floodplain connectivity, but I'm just going to kind of just touch on things a little bit here. So this parameter does evaluate how connected the stream is to the adjacent floodplain or bankful bench, because you might be sitting there going, well, he can't say that because not all streams have floodplains. And that's true. If you're working in a mountain environment and you're in a colluvial valley or a V-shaped valley, maybe even just a confined valley, you may not have a floodplain, but you would have a bankful bench. And so that's why we put that or here. So floodplain or bankful bench. And so we do require floodplain connectivity to be assessed in all stream systems. But the functional capacity, which are these reference curves, are stratified by stream type, so to account for what I just said. You don't want to score a colluvial valley stream in the same way that you would score an unconfined alluvial valley. And so that is accounted for in something we call stratification. So you're going to hear that throughout the day, that one way we deal with the fact that streams are all different across a state is through stratification. And this is your first kind of example or flavor of doing that. All right, so there are two metrics. There's the bank height ratio and the entrenchment ratio. And it's really the entrenchment ratio that is stratified, and we stratify by Roskin's stream type for reference condition. And I'll explain that in a minute with an example. It is regionalized by bankful width and depth. You'll notice that both of these metrics are ratios. And so we can handle also other variability in sites by dividing by the bankful width in the case of the entrenchment ratio, and the bankful depth in the case of the bank height ratio. So it's normalizing these values and taking stream size into account. And we do have reference standards both from the literature and from Alaska data. All right, so this one I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit on this one because I think it's so important. So here are the two metrics, bank height ratio and entrenchment ratio. So I'm going to look at the stream in cross-section view for bank height ratio, and we have to identify two features. We have to identify bankful, which should be here, and we have to identify the height of the low bank. So we got to look at both sides and say which bank is lower, and that's the one we'll pick, because as this channel fills up with water, it will begin to spill onto the adjacent land area on this side at the low bank. And so then we find the deepest part of the channel, which is the thaw wag, and we would measure from the thaw wag to the height of the low bank and divide that number by the max bankful depth. And we call that the bank height ratio. And so the perfect number is 1. And if we have a bank height ratio of 1, which you kind of see in this picture, and you can see this is right at a bankful flow where water is beginning to flow onto this bankful bench, that's what we want to see. So in other words, to make this simple, the top of bank and bankful are the same elevation. That's a bank height ratio of 1. What we don't want to see is that number get higher. High bank height ratios mean the stream is incised, and functionally, that's a bad thing. But this bank height ratio, while it does tell us it's a direct measure of incision, it does not tell us how far water can spread once it gets out of the channel. And so that's where the entrenchment ratio comes in. The entrenchment ratio is the flood-prone width divided by the bankful width. And so they work together. You know, bank height ratio tells us when can water access that flat ground, and then entrenchment ratio says once it does reach that, how far can it spread? Is it a bench or is it a floodplain? Now there is a catch to this. So the catch is that this flood-prone width elevation is at an elevation that's 2 times the bankful max depth. So if this depth from here to here was 3, we would say 3 times 2 is 6. We would come up to the line here, and then we would run that out to the left and to the right until we hit ground. And that's our flood-prone width. And so it's not, you can't just take any valley width and measure that for your flood-prone width, because sometimes you have systems that are so incised, the flood-prone width is still contained in the channel. And when that happens, you are both incised and entrenched. And I'm going to show you some picture examples. All right, so here's a stream restoration project. This is what we want to see from a floodplain connectivity perspective in an unconfined alluvial valley, or if you're playing the Roskin stream classification, this is an E, but a C and an E would be very similar. An E might have an even bigger floodplain than a C, but they're both generally in unconfined alluvial valleys. So in this example, the bank height ratio is 1. That means the top of bank is bankful, and when water can get out, it can spread in the southeast, what we call a country mile. It can spread a long way. And in fact, here is a picture of a flood flow. This is during the remnants of a hurricane that came through this little mountain town in North Carolina. You can see some pretty high velocity water coming out of the culvert, but then look, as it moves down into this floodplain, it just spreads out. And so you have very low energy in your floodplain. As a restoration practitioner, that's what we want. We want really big floodplains. All right, so now we'll take a little trip to West Virginia, and you can see, okay, this is a very different looking stream. This is what we call a colluvial valley. Colluvial valleys don't have floodplains in the same way that unconfined alluvial valleys do, but they still have a bankful indicator, a bankful feature. In this case, it's the top of the bank, and so our bank height ratio is 1. So that's identical. Both sites, even though they look very different, both have bank height ratios of 1. The difference is in the entrenchment ratio. And so since this only has bankful benches on both sides, when we double that depth, it takes us to the back of those benches. And our entrenchment ratio is 1.8. That's a moderate entrenchment ratio, but it is still functioning for this stream type. This is a B stream type, again, if you're playing the Roskin classification game. All right, here's another reclamation project in Alaska. And so these concepts are brought forward and used in practice. This is one of BLM's demonstration projects. And so you can see the bank height ratio is 1. Again, that's really what we always want to see. And in this case, there's a bench on both sides. And so that flood-prone width, when we double that depth, this depth is doubled in a riffle, I should add. And then you go out to the left until you hit ground, out to the right until you hit ground. So in this case, the entrenchment ratio is 2.1, still in that moderate range, but functioning for a B stream type in a colluvial valley. All right, here's where it's a little tricky, and this is important. So in this example, it's not functioning. This is an example from San Antonio, Texas. So here's bankful, and when you double that bankful depth, you are still within the channel. And so look at the numbers now. Our bank height ratio is greater than 2, and our entrenchment ratio is very low at 1.1. What you really do not want to see are high bank height ratios and low entrenchment ratios. You want it to be the other way around. And so in this case, it is not functioning. Now, I mentioned early on that these reference curves are stratified by stream type based on reference condition. And so here's what I mean. This stream type is an F stream type. It is a degraded stream type in an urban environment. This valley is an unconfined alluvial valley. The proper stream type here, the reference stream type, would be a C. And so we are evaluating the entrenchment ratio against a C stream type and not an F stream type. If we were in some mountain gorge somewhere and you were working with a natural F, things would be different. But that's not the example, the scenario that I'm showing you here. So this will become a little bit clearer, or just remember this comment for when we play with the spreadsheet later this afternoon. All right, so here's an Alaskan example. This is a mine reclamation project where they really just took all of the tailings and pushed it right next to the channel, and then took their large rock and just armored the banks. And so again, bankful is way down here. You double bankful, here's your flood-prone width. We've got that nasty high bank height ratio with a low entrenchment ratio. In this valley setting, it should be a B stream type. So the bank height ratio should be 1. The entrenchment ratio should be moderate. But in neither case is it, and so it would be not functioning. This is one thing I hope the SQT will incentivize as people do more work in Alaska, is to stop doing this. Stop bringing the tailings right next to the channel and creating such a confined system. Do a bench and give it a little bit of a bankful bench first. All right, so that was floodplain connectivity. The next parameter is flow dynamics. And so this is looking within the channel. Flow dynamics is the bankful width, width to depth ratio metric. And so it is assessing flow in the channel kind of at bankful. So you can see in this example, they're pulling this tape, getting their bankful width, and then they would measure the area underneath this, and then the area divided by the width would give them the mean depth. And this is primarily measuring the risk of aggradation as expressed as observed over expected. And so this is kind of what you would want to see. Like, this is a nice cross section. It is not a grading or degrading. By the way, our bank height ratio picks up degradation. This parameter is picking up the aggradation, which is sort of the filling up of the channel with sediment. And you can see that here. Here's a placer mine site in the Alaska interior that is a grading. So it's filling up with sediment. So as I mentioned, this is an observed over expected. So the first thing you have to do is figure out where your bankful indicator is. In this example, you know, there is a little bit of a channel here. It's very shallow. You might be inclined to say bankful is right here, but it is not. Bankful is the very back of this floodplain. So this would be your bankful indicator, and there really is not an indicator on this side. It's just the road embankment. So that would be your observed width, and you would have a width to depth ratio associated with that. And then next you have to get, well, what's the expected width to depth ratio? And so you have kind of two options for this. One, and really the ideal, is you could go upstream or downstream and find an unimpacted reach and measure your bankful cross section there and just take that width to depth ratio, and that would be your expected. If you do not have that, then you can use something we call bankful regional curves. So these are the Wade Creek, or that now we call them the 40-mile regional curves. You can see mean depth on this x-axis, width on this, y-axis, mean depth and width, and both of them are functions of drainage area. And so if you know your drainage area, you can calculate the width and you can calculate the mean depth. You could use that as your expected value for this parameter. So just to show this all the way through, in that example, your observed was a bankful width of 166 feet divided by 1.5 gives you a width to depth ratio of 111. That is huge, by the way. Your regional curve would give you a value of 19. And so that width to depth ratio state would be the 111 divided by 19 is 5.8, which you would then put as a percent. You'd multiply that by 100 and enter 580 into the SQT. And that would give you, if you put that in, not functioning. Since it's observed over expected, the 1.0 pristine is 100%. Your observed is 100% of the expected. And you can actually be too high with this metric. That's your aggradation component. You can be too low, which actually is a degradation side if the bank height ratio is increasing. So with this metric, a low width to depth ratio is a good thing as long as your bank height ratio is also low. But if your bank height ratio is high and your width depth ratio is coming down, that is an increase in velocity and energy in the channel, and the tool will show that. All right, so moving our way on up, now we'll enter the geomorphology category. This will be our last category. And just remember that that functional statement is the transport of wood and sediment to create diverse bed forms and support dynamic equilibrium. And then the parameters that we're going to go over are bed form diversity, lateral migration, riparian vegetation, and large woody debris. And just remember that you may also do bed material characterization pretty frequently, especially if you're working on doing restoration or reclamation work associated with mines. All right, so let's do bed form diversity first. So this assesses the condition of in-stream habitat. So think riffles and pools. So if I had to pick one parameter out of the whole SQT that was most synonymous with habitat, it would be this parameter. Other parameters, are habitat as well, but this one, it typically is just what we're thinking of for habitat. Macroinvertebrate communities in the riffles, fish communities in the pools, to oversimplify my biology. And so we're going to look at pool spacing ratio, pool depth ratio, and percent riffle as our three metrics. And this one is also stratified by Roskin stream type. And the reason is very similar to what I was saying before with floodplain connectivity. This is a meandering stream with an unconfined alluvial valley. And so your pool spacing in particular is going to be different in this kind of system, a meandering system, than in a step pool system. That pool spacing is going to be different. And so we stratify our performance standards, reference standards, based on these different stream types. So again, this would be like your C and E stream types. This would be your B stream types. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of the how, I guess, with the measurement, just to maybe reinforce the what and the why. So here's a profile of the stream bed. This is the brown line. The cyan line is your water surface, and then these blue dots are where the bankful indicator was surveyed. The solid blue line just connects the dots, and then the dashed line is a best fit line through your bankful point. So this is a very standard longitudinal profile from a stream survey that most hydrologists and geomorphologists do. We're just calling out the bed forms as we see them. And so when we look at the profile and you see these dips, that's a pool. And in the software we're using, the little blue dot recognizes that that's the beginning of a pool. So for this measurement, we find the deepest part of the pool, and then we measure downstream to the deepest part of the next pool. And we just continue doing that until we get to all of the pools that are in that reach. And then the math is just the pool spacing, so this spacing, divided by the bankful width, which would be from a representative riffle cross-section from that reach. This width is normalizing that value by stream size. So we can compare streams in smaller watersheds to streams in bigger watersheds. So if we look at this again in sort of our meandering stream, our C and E stream type, this would be very easy. Pool spacing would be from the outside of one meander bend downstream to the outside of the next meander bend. And we would find the deepest part of that bend. And there would be a tape that we would pull down the channel, and we would just measure that distance. So this would be one pool spacing. Here would be the next one from here to here, and then here to here, and so on. This measurement, if you were walking along this riffle, this crossover would be called a riffle in a gravel and sand bed system for this assessment and many assessments. If there was a pool right here, because maybe there was a piece of wood or a rock that was creating scour, you would not count that pool for pool-to-pool spacing in this assessment method. You would still count it for depth, and you would count it as part of the percent riffle, but not for spacing. And so the percent riffle really is just these crossover links. So you would add this length, and then come down here and add from here to here, and so on. For those of you that are used to like measuring bed forms in more detail and adding glides and runs, for this method, we are lumping the glides into the pool and the run into the riffle. All right, so now let's go to our B stream types. They look very different. The pool spacing process is different. You know, those pool spacing is formed in a meandering stream through lateral meandering. And these systems, it's almost like vertical meandering through our step pool system. And so I love these two pictures. You can see this nice cascade here and this just awesome, what we call geomorphic pool downstream of that cascade. And then here's a step with another pool. And so we would count this pool in the pool-to-pool spacing measurement as well as in our pool depth measurement. This is actually a picture from Wyoming. Here's a picture from Denali National Park. And you can see here we have this cascade. There's a step at the downstream end of the cascade. So a cascade step. Here is a large geomorphic pool. That counts as spacing. This is a step. And then here's another pool. And so you do have a pool-to-pool spacing that would be measured from the deepest part of the pool here to the deepest part of the pool here. And you would have a pool up here, can't really see it as well, but this pool would come from there through this cascade to here. And you can kind of tell if you look really close within this cascade, there's a small pool in this cascade. We would not count that. They have to be the large, we call them geomorphic pools, the large pools associated with these structures. And there is guidance in the user manual about what counts as a pool and what does not count as a pool. All right, so the next is pool depth. In Alaska, this is where you might want to invest in a dry suit, especially if you're working in those rivers that are barely wadeable. You know, we we count a wadeable stream as being able to wade the riffle, but sometimes those pools are over your head and your water's cold. So I recommend a dry suit if you're going to be working in some of these bigger systems. A couple of things to note here is that when you are finding that max pool depth, it is not a base flow depth. You are measuring from the deepest part of the bed up to that bank full feature. So it is a bank full depth so that we don't have to worry about annual or, that variation in base flow depth. If you came out day one and base flow was a foot deep, but I came out the next day or next week and base flow was 1.5 feet, we're going to get different measurements just because there was different base flow. So to make that more consistent, we are looking at a bankful pool depth, and we're dividing it by the mean riffle depth, again, to normalize that data so we can account for streams of different size. Okay, so now we're moving on. Our next parameter is the lateral migration parameter. So this is looking really at bank stability. In fact, early on, we called this bank stability. And then once we added armoring as a metric, we realized, okay, armoring is a form of stability, and we're calling this bank stability. That's not really representing the process like we want to represent. So we changed the parameter name to lateral migration so that we can assess whether a stream is migrating too much or if it's been armored and not allowed to migrate. That way we can capture both. But I will say, well, I was going to say more often than not, we're dealing with too much bank erosion. That probably isn't, it depends. It depends on who you are and who your client is and the type of work you're doing. Working in placer mine reclamation, generally we're dealing with banks that are eroding and we're trying to make them not erode. Or I work a lot in ag land as well. Same thing. We're working in areas that have a lot of erosion and we're trying to minimize that erosion. All right, so this parameter assesses the potential for stream banks to laterally erode beyond what would be considered natural. So for some of you who might be sitting here going, but stream bank erosion is a natural process, we agree. We are not saying that streams should not move. We are not saying streams should have no bank erosion. We are trying to capture what would be considered above that natural rate. The metrics that go with lateral migration do include this combination of a geotechnical look at the bank as well as a hydraulic look at the bank, and it's semi-quantitative. Some of the components of the assessment you can measure, others are more of an observation. And then, like I mentioned, armoring is included if armoring is present. And so if armoring is not present, then you do not assess armoring. If armoring is proposed but does not exist in the existing condition, you would put a 0 for the existing condition and then put in your armoring value for the proposed. And it does need to be anthropogenic armoring. So if there's bedrock, you would not count that as armoring. Okay, so the metrics that we use are a dominant B-high near bank stress metric. That stands for Bank Erosion Hazard Index. That's the geotechnical look at the bank. So we would measure bank height, measure bank angle. If we can see roots, we would measure root depth. If we cannot see roots, this is where having a botanist with you is a good thing. We would estimate root density visually, estimate surface protection visually, and then make assessment of the bank materials. Like, is this a very sandy bank or is there a lot of clay in the bank? And then you can make adjustments based on that stratification. So that's the geotechnical look at the bank. That's the B-high component. And then the near bank stress component is the hydraulics look. This ranges from there are 7 methods for doing this. One is qualitative and some of the others are more quantitative. So that's one metric. The next metric is this percent stream bank erosion. Again, it is as a percent. And then finally, as I mentioned, was the stream bank armoring. So I'm not going to go into ton of detail here. I mean, like I could spend all day explaining the Beehive near bank stress. It is mentioned in the user manual. There is literature out there that tells you how to do this. I just want to kind of paint some pictures of what you could do activity-wise to make these improvements. So you can see the bank on the left looks really bad. So it has a Beehive near bank stress rating of extreme, that's the geotechnical look, and very high near bank stress. This picture on the right has a Beehive near bank stress of low high. And in fact, this bank is just upstream of this bank. This is on the right meander bend, and this is a left meander bend that's eroding into a terrace. So an activity could be simply pulling this stream off of that terrace, making it access this floodplain, and you could dramatically improve your Beehive near bank stress score. Now the other component is the percent of erosion. And so percent of erosion is of your project reach, what percent of the length is actively eroding. So you would look at every outside meander bend, but in this case, this bend is really not eroding. And so while it will get a Beehive near bank stress rating, it's not going to be included in the percent erosion. This bank down here, you can see this tree blew up and put right here. Now this one would have an erosion score with Beehive near bank stress. It would probably be moderate or high Beehive with a very high near bank stress. And so this would be counted as part of the percent erosion. So these two metrics go together. The Beehive gives you the magnitude of the problem. Basically, it says where you have bank erosion or where you're most likely to have bank erosion, like the outside of a meander bend. Is it eroding or not? Like in this case, no, it's great. In this case, yes, it is. And then the percent erosion is telling you how widespread that problem is. What is the overall extent of the erosion problem? And then finally is armoring. As I mentioned, armoring would be hard techniques that prevent lateral migration. So it's really the other side of the coin. Are we putting in so much riprap and concrete and gabion baskets that we are preventing that lateral migration? And if we are, we would call that armoring. You would not assess the Beehive near bank stress. Like if you were assessing this bank, you would just call it armored. You would not also do a Beehive near bank stress on it. Same for here. This would be an armored bank. Okay, so we've got two more parameters. We're looking good for time, so we'll go over these and I think have some time for questions as well. So our next parameter is riparian vegetation. Some of the benefits of that riparian vegetation are shading, which may be increasingly important for Alaska. Organic matter contributions. So as we get leaf litter that falls into the stream, or even trees themselves, those branches, willows and alders are not big enough to be counted as large wood, but as they come into the stream, they would be considered organic matter. This riparian vegetation is a form of energy dissipation and can capture sediment. We've seen this work really well in our demonstration projects. When we use transplants along the bank, we can get a foot of sand deposited into those transplants. Nutrient uptake is certainly a riparian buffer benefit, although probably more interest in a place like North Carolina, where I am, than Alaska, where you are. You could probably use some nutrients. And so if you want some poultry litter from North Carolina, we'd be happy to send some your way. We have more than we need. Stabilization of the stream bank is really key. We're using transplants a lot in our demonstration projects to provide that bank stabilization and kind of instant riparian vegetation. And then finally, landscape connectivity. See our little wood frog here, providing that habitat outside of the stream in that riparian area, and then connecting it between downstream and upstream reaches. The metrics in the Alaska tool are riparian extent. That riparian extent is something we've been using with SQTs more and more. And so that kind of the idea came from other SQTs. The vegetative complexity and the percent native cover are from the AIM methodology. And so BLM's AIM method, many of you or some of you may know about, and Matt was mentioning that local data. This is one reason we picked these metrics, is because we had local data from that program. So riparian extent is not part of AIM, but the vegetative complexity and the percent native cover is. All right, so I'm going to focus on the riparian extent. It's, I think, pretty conceptual. It actually acknowledges, well, riparian extent gets more at the geomorphology of your riparian area rather than calling it a buffer. So if you were working with me in the eastern United States, you know, when we work with Minnesota and Tennessee and Michigan and North Carolina and South Carolina, buffer width is a thing. And it's like, we have a stream and we want 50 feet or 100 feet of buffer primarily to encourage denitrification. Well, that doesn't really apply as a functional issue in Alaska or really in the West. And the geomorphology is so much more obvious in these regions. Like, we can see the valley bottom. Your valley bottom is not 10 miles wide, at least in the region that we're working. Certainly there are places in Alaska, and especially some of the bigger rivers, where the valleys are huge. But where we're working like this, it's very obvious where that valley bottom is. And so we're using that as our riparian extent. And we're basically measuring, again, an observed over expected value. So first we delineate this boundary over here and over here, and then we just look at that width and we say, is there natural vegetation across that width? And if there is, then your observed equals your expected, which is what we see here. If it's more like this, so this is a site that is an abandoned mine, it's been like this for 50 years, you can again see what the expected extent is, but your observed is almost zero, right? There is almost no vegetated, natural vegetation across this width. So if the first example was a pristine example, a 1.0, this would be your 0. And so, of course, if you could go from this to this, that would be huge functional lift. You would be taking riparian vegetation from a 0 to a 1. That is not going to happen in any kind of restoration, reclamation, or mitigation scenario, because to go from this to this in Alaska will take centuries, and no one wants to measure that long. So you will see when we get into the SQT and this concept called proposed condition, it is the proposed condition at the end of monitoring. So while you cannot do this, you can do this. And this is back to that reclamation slide I showed earlier, where we did put transplants along that bankful bench. So you certainly can jumpstart that setting and go from a 0 to well into the functioning at risk range for your riparian veg. So this tool will definitely incentivize people to do transplants over just like seeding or live stakes, which would take even longer to establish riparian vegetation. All right, last one is large wood. So in this method, large wood is defined as dead wood that is standing or fallen, that's over 1.5 meters in length and at least 10 centimeters in diameter. It must be within or spanning the bankful channel, and the metric is very simple. This is one of the simpler ways to measure wood. It's just large woody debris frequency that's counted as the number of pieces of wood that are 1.5 centimeters long at least, or over 1.5 meters in length by at least 10 centimeters in diameter per 100 meters. And this also comes from BLM's AIM method because, again, we had data in the interior that we could use to develop the reference curves. This one is only required when trees are a natural part of that stream corridor. So if you were working at 2,500 feet and there were no trees, you would not need to do wood. But in most of the interior, this would be included. All right, so some of the benefits and the reasons that we include this is that it does create that heterogeneity in habitat, provides cover for fish. It creates a heterogeneity in your bed material. So often you'd have finer grain sediments upstream of that wood and coarser sediments downstream. It helps dissipate energy and it retains organic matter. And so this parameter should also incentivize people to actually incorporate some wood into their restoration projects. So one way we've been doing this in the demonstration projects is to use wood along the toe, the bed of this is in a bend, it's a little bit hard to tell, but we put some of the large wood from the bottom of the channel up to sort of the higher end of base flow and then transplants above that. And then this is a project that the Forest Service did on the Kenai Peninsula where they actually used engineered log jams. And it's a little bit hard right now, in my opinion, to use this method for engineered log jams. So I'm hoping that over time we can actually improve. There are some other methods that we could potentially use that would capture jams a little bit better. So, you know, stay tuned for the future. All right, so that is it. I have talked a lot. It's definitely time for a break, but we do have 12 minutes. So if people do have some questions about either presentation, happy to try to answer them.
Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself to ask any questions.
This is where it's better to be in person.
Then you could stare people down, right?
Yeah, I could call on somebody. I can tell by the look in your eye that you have a question. All right. I'll give you another 30 seconds. All right, Bradley, I see you turned your camera on. Do you have a question? Oh, all right. All right, well, Ellen, I will turn it over to you if there's anything to say before lunch. And
nope, just that we'll be taking an hour lunch. So we will sign back in at 10 till 1 Alaska time. It's 10 till noon according to my time. So just an hour from now. And you can just hang out on the webinar. We're not going to shut it down if you just want to mute yourself and turn off your camera. But we'll be ready to go in an hour from now. So thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay. I'll see you all in an hour.